Chancellor.
Let's get more on this developing story. Paul Smith joins us, Associate Professor in French History and Politics at the University of Nottingham. Paul, as always, great to have you on the programme. What's your reading of this diplomatic row?
It's a bit of a disappointment, I think, for certainly for the French, after they hoped that after a phone call between Macron and the Moroccan President Tebboune that relations were going to sort of level out. But then, of course, this has carried on. But my interpretation of this is that there, exactly as your reporter said, there are so many different factors feeding in here, not least of which, of course, is also domestic politics in France, with Bruno Retailleau being blamed by the Algerian authorities for what's happened in terms of the arrest of the Algerian nationals, but also, of course, Retailleau trying to look like a tough man in relation to the campaign to become president of Les Républicains, and of course the far right also sort of upping the ante with regard to the attitude towards Algeria. So there are all sorts of factors playing in here to this current crisis, which is just every time we think that it's calmed itself down, it just explodes again.
So in many ways, I should say, it's been like a pot waiting to boil over with so many aspects coming into this. Of course, perhaps most importantly, the decision by Emmanuel Macron to take Morocco's side over the Western Sahara.
Yes, and that was, I was thinking back about this a little bit earlier on, that things seem to be going so well. In 2022, not long after Macron was re-elected president, one of his big sort of coups was to go to Algeria, have what looked like a really productive meeting with the Algerian president, who you're seeing there on the screen, back in August of 2022, and then it slowly unravelled. And then, as you say, in last year, he takes the side, as it were, and certainly that's the way it's seen in Algiers, taking the side of the Moroccans over the Western Sahara. And this is about a triangular relationship between Rabat, the Moroccan capital, Algiers and Paris as well, and of course greater geopolitical issues with regard to the relationship between Morocco and Israel, but also, of course, the relationship between Algiers and Rabat, over the question of Rif separatism in Morocco, supported by the Algerians, and also Kabyle separatism supported in Algeria, supported by the Moroccans. So there's this kind of endless kind of problematic of so many different players around this, but it all kind of centers on this relationship between the former colonial power and Algeria, between France and Algeria.
You mentioned colonial times there, Paul. Is the fundamental problem between France and Algeria what goes right back to the War of Independence, which of course ended in 1962?
Yeah, before even I was born. So, that's how long ago it was. But that there is this sort of sense, and I've said it to you before, and not just in regard to this, but this sort of sense of the war is over, and yet it isn't. And what's actually quite frustrating, I suppose, is that Macron has been very strong on the idea of trying to bring together Algerian and French historians to talk about the way that the war can be remembered and independence can be remembered, and the French and the Franco-Algerian relationship can be remembered, and trying to take all the you can't just do it through history, but trying to at least take some of the points and the toxicity out of that relationship and try to normalize it. Ben Stora, for example, very important figure in that process from the French side, but that keeps, despite Macron's best intentions. In 2017, he described French colonial domination of Algeria as a crime against humanity, and that seemed to pave the way for something new. But that kind of project, that cultural project, seems to keep stumbling over considerations in the two capitals, in Paris and in Algiers. France is not, uniquely responsible for this situation. There is the Algerian part as well, and the regime in Algiers is what is happening in Algiers is fundamental as well. But it is still a very long process, and it doesn't seem to be any closer to resolution.
Nonetheless, though, France, Algeria, the two peoples, there's a kind of inextricable link, isn't there? How can a better relationship be forged, Paul? I know this is something that many people are still trying to get a handle on, but I'm asking you, do you have any sort of sense of where progress could be made? Is there something that maybe comes to mind that you think, could be explored by both sides?
I think at a very basic level, I think most Algerians and most French people get on perfectly well. But the problem is that there's often a mismatch between when Paris is ready to make concessions or to take a particular approach, and when Algiers is ready to take a particular approach. And of course, in Algerian politics, you're dealing with a very powerful president who has a particular way of seeing his role and his relationship with the rest of the world, his position within Algiers. And then, of course, you have, France is trying to manage its geopolitical relationship, but also, of course, France is seen as being the place where opponents of the current regime can find, safe haven, can find refuge. So that then creates a political problem, so that and then you have the far right in France using Algeria as a kind of as kind of the bête noire, the scapegoat. Both sides want to do that. So it's very difficult to see how these, at the top level, how these things are resolved. And yet we know that it can happen if there's a political will. If we think about South Africa, the process of reconciliation there, if we think about Northern Ireland from the British example, these things can happen. But it's difficult to see exactly at this moment precisely what is that event that brings that big turn in the relationship.
Paul Smith, thank you as always for your assessment and your take on the story. We really do appreciate it. Associate Professor in French History and Politics at the University of Nottingham. Paul, thank you very much indeed. We watch, of course, for developments on this story. Just to remind you, France recalling its ambassador to Algeria. There's been an exchange of expulsions of embassy staff, and this all centres on a row over Algerian nationals being arrested in Paris last Friday.